Breaking: Trump attacks Canada, and what happened next shocked everyone. This is not a routine political clash. It is not a passing campaign provocation, not a colorful exchange designed to fill a news cycle and disappear beneath the next manufactured outrage. What has just unfolded carries a deeper significance than the headline alone can contain. When Donald Trump launched an attack on Canada and Mark Carney answered with a defiant, disciplined, unmistakably sovereign reply that sent a crowd into a roar, the real story was not the noise. The real story was the boundary that suddenly became visible. A line was tested, and for one electrifying moment, the world saw what happens when an old style of intimidation collides with a colder, more organized, more strategic form of resistance. Because this was never simply about rhetoric. It was about hierarchy. It was about whether a neighboring country bound by commerce, geography, military coordination, and decades of habit could be treated as an instrument in another nation's domestic theater. It was about whether political force, once projected with enough volume and enough menace, could still bend allied democracies into postures of caution. And the answer, delivered not in legal language or diplomatic memo, but in the unmistakable rhythm of political counterforce, was no, not this time, not in that room, not in that register. That is why the reaction mattered. That is why the crowd's response mattered. Because power is never just what is said. Power is what lands. Power is what sticks. Power is what the audience recognizes as legitimate. Trump's political method has always depended on asymmetry. He does not merely argue, he overwhelms. He does not simply criticize, he seeks to define the frame in which everyone else must respond. The objective is larger than winning the point. The objective is to impose psychological terrain. Once that terrain is secured, others are forced into reactive positions, trimming their language, narrowing their posture, and conceding the emotional center of the confrontation. That is how political dominance is built in modern populist combat. Not only through policy, but through atmosphere, not only through institutions, but through intimidation. And for years, that method has worked often enough to become a doctrine. But doctrines decay when conditions change. The tactic that terrifies fragmented opponents can fail against disciplined rebuttal. The style that crushes weak institutions can falter when it meets a national audience prepared not to flinch. That is what made Carney's response so consequential. He did not merely answer an attack, he neutralized the method. He refused the emotional script. He did not shrink the confrontation, he elevated it. He transformed what could have remained a loud insult into a question of national dignity, democratic adulthood, and strategic self-respect. In doing so, he shifted the axis of the moment. Suddenly, the issue was no longer what Trump had accused, implied, or threatened. The issue became something much larger. Who gets to speak for stability in a time of deliberate destabilization? That reversal is the heart of the backfire. Publicly, the event can be narrated as an attack met by a sharp comeback. That is the shallow version. The deeper version is that an intended demonstration of dominance became an exposure of limits. Trump moved to project force outward and instead illuminated where force ceases to command obedience. The spectacle turned, the current reversed, the attack expanded the stature of the target. That is one of the oldest laws in political struggle. When coercive language is deployed against a figure who can translate pressure into poise, the aggressor may discover too late that he has built the platform for his opponent's rise. Carney's advantage in such a moment is not simply verbal competence, it is symbolic positioning. He speaks from a tradition very different from Trump's. The contrast is almost surgical. On one side stands disruption as identity, confrontation as instinct, instability as leverage. On the other stands managerial legitimacy, financial literacy, institutional memory, and the cultivated language of state endurance. Ordinarily, that contrast can appear bloodless. In calmer times, the figure of disciplined establishment competence can seem too restrained for an age intoxicated by spectacle. But in a moment of external attack, the hierarchy flips. Suddenly, steadiness is not dull, it is strength. Seriousness is not technocratic detachment, it is national ballast. Precision becomes power, because the public understands what is being defended. And that is why the crowd roared, not merely because a line was clever, not merely because a political rival had been answered, uncensored. Crowds roar when they feel relief. Crowds roar when someone says with clarity and force what they feared was no longer being said on their behalf. The reaction was not only emotional. It was constitutional in spirit. It was the sound of an audience recognizing itself again as a political community rather than a passive object in someone else's performance. That distinction matters in democratic societies. Legitimacy does not live only in statutes and elections. It lives in moments when people sense that someone has articulated the boundary between negotiation and humiliation. There is a wider strategic lesson here, and it reaches far beyond Canada. The age of casual American assumption is under pressure. For decades, Washington's partners learned to absorb turbulence from the United States because the underlying architecture seemed permanent. Institutions would hold, treaties would endure, economic integration would outlast personalities. The center, however bruised, would ultimately reassert itself. But repeated shocks have altered that psychology. Allies no longer treat American political volatility as noise around a stable core. They increasingly treat it as a structural variable. And once that shift occurs, every attack, every threat, every impulsive declaration is processed differently, not as theater alone, but as data, not as aberration, but as warning. Canada sits at the center of that recalculation in a uniquely exposed way. No major country is both so close to the United States and so vulnerable to its political mood swings, while also being so determined to preserve its independent identity. Geography ties it in, trade locks it in, security cooperation fuses enormous parts of its strategic horizon to Washington's. Yet proximity creates its own nationalism. The closer the pressure, the stronger the need for distinction. Canada cannot relocate, it cannot detach, it cannot indulge in fantasies of strategic isolation, which means that sovereignty is not defended through distance. It is defended through posture, through institutions, through economic diversification where possible, and through the repeated public demonstration that partnership does not equal submission. That is the true significance of the encounter. Trump's attack, whatever its immediate wording or tactical purpose, touched a live nerve in North American politics, the assumption that Canada can be rhetorically pushed, economically squeezed, or symbolically diminished without producing a larger reaction. That assumption is dangerous because it misunderstands how middle powers survive. They survive not by matching the giant beside them in scale, but by strengthening the cost of disrespect. They survive by converting identity into resilience, law into leverage, alliances into insulation, and public unity into deterrence. They cannot win dominance contests on raw mass. They win by making coercion politically expensive. And in this moment, Carney appeared to understand that with unusual clarity. Rather than responding as though the issue were a personal dispute, he responded as though it were a test of the political order surrounding Canada. That is a higher level of answer. It signals to domestic audiences that the matter at hand is not vanity, but sovereignty. It signals to external actors that pressure will not merely be parried. It will be reframed. Most importantly, it tells markets, institutions, and allied capitals that Canada intends to occupy the role of a serious state, not a nervous subordinate. That may sound abstract. It is not. In geopolitics, abstraction becomes behavior, and behavior becomes consequence. Consider the economic layer. When political attacks are aimed at allied states, investors do not hear only words. They hear future friction. They hear risk premiums. They hear the possibility of tariffs, regulatory retaliation, border slowdowns, commodity politicization, and the contamination of what should be stable commercial assumptions. North America's economic strength has long depended on predictability inside interdependence. Once major figures begin treating that interdependence as a weapon to be brandished, the calculation changes. Supply chains seek redundancy, capital looks for buffers, corporate planning shifts from efficiency to resilience. Every theatrical attack against a close partner plants the idea that political volatility must now be priced in. That is where the backfire grows more severe. The short-term tactic may energize a faction, dominate a media segment, or produce applause in partisan space, but the long-term effect can be corrosive to the very sphere of influence that power depends upon. Great powers do not lead by frightening everyone all the time. They lead by convincing others that alignment with them is safer than estrangement. When that belief weakens, influence erodes even before formal alliances break. Trust, once damaged, does not disappear in a single dramatic rupture. It drains gradually through cumulative episodes in which partners conclude that prudence requires emotional distance and strategic hedging. Canada is not merely another country in this equation, it is a mirror. What happens in US-Canada political confrontation reveals something intimate about the state of the Western democratic core. If this relationship becomes a venue for symbolic dominance tests rather than structured cooperation, the message to the rest of the world is unmistakable. The Atlantic system is no longer governed primarily by confidence, it is governed by volatility. And when volatility becomes the signature of the center, peripheral actors adjust, rivals probe, opportunists bargain harder, allies diversify quietly. The cost of every domestic flourish rises because the international audience is no longer separating internal performance from external reliability. This is why Carney's response landed with such force. It was not just resistance, it was stabilization durist. He appeared to say, in effect, that seriousness still has a language, that national dignity can still be defended without descending into chaos, and that answerable democratic power does not need to imitate demagogic force in order to defeat it. That is an important distinction. Too often, leaders confronted with high-volume political aggression believe they must mirror the aggressor's style in order to survive, but mimicry carries its own defeat. Once everyone speaks the language of destabilization, destabilization wins. The more difficult path is to absorb the attack, redirect the frame, and emerge looking larger rather than louder. That is what elevates this beyond political theater and into the realm of strategic communication. States communicate not only through treaties and forced deployments, but through visible moments of elite behavior. When a leader answers external pressure with composure and precision, that performance enters the bloodstream of national perception. Citizens feel less cornered, institutions feel less isolated, international observers update their judgments. The market may not cheer audibly, diplomats may not clap on camera, but a serious answer has effects. It tells every stakeholder that the country retains a governing class capable of interpreting turbulence rather than simply reacting to it. The contrast with Trump's political energy is therefore especially revealing. Trump thrives in environments where confusion helps him. He benefits when norms appear weak, when opponents seem unsure which register to use, and when the confrontation itself becomes the center of gravity. But there are moments when disruption produces the opposite of intended paralysis. There are moments when it clarifies. People who were previously divided on secondary matters suddenly recognize a primary one. People who may disagree on domestic policy close ranks around sovereignty, respect, and the inadmissibility of external belittlement. In such cases, the attack does not fragment the other side, it consolidates it. That is the backfire. In strategic terms, pressure generating cohesion, and cohesion once activated can travel. It can move from the rally hall to the cabinet table, from the speech to the balance sheet, from the emotional moment to the durable policy shift. A country that feels publicly challenged can begin rethinking deeper questions. How dependent is too dependent? Which industries require insulation? Which export routes need reinforcement? Which alliances must be deepened? Which institutions need to be prepared for repeated external shocks? These are not sentimental questions, they are statecraft questions. If enough such moments accumulate, nations do not merely complain, they redesign, quietly at first, then permanently. That is where this story enters the larger map of global transformation. We are living through a period in which traditional assumptions about the behavior of major democracies are under sustained revision. Domestic populism does not stay domestic. Economic nationalism does not stop at the border. Personalist politics does not remain personal when exercised by figures associated with great power machinery. Every democratic ally now has to ask a difficult question. How do you maintain integration with a giant partner whose political currents may at any moment seek advantage through threat, insult, or instability? There is no easy answer, but one element is clear. You cannot solve that problem by acting smaller than you are. Carney's response, at least in symbolic terms, rejected smallness. It rejected the posture of careful shrinkage that often characterizes middle power anxiety. That is why it felt larger than a normal political answer. It gave form to a doctrine that many democracies are now searching for: firmness without hysteria, confidence without illusion, partnership without dependence of spirit. This matters well beyond Ottawa or Washington. European capitals are watching such moments. Asian allies are watching such moments. Financial centers are watching. They're asking whether the countries inside America's orbit can develop a political language robust enough to absorb American volatility without disintegrating under it. There is another layer still, and it concerns legitimacy inside the United States itself. When Trump attacks a neighboring democracy, and the result is a strong, resonant assertion of national dignity from the other side, the spectacle rebounds inward. It invites American observers to ask what exactly is being projected in their name: strength or compulsion mistaken for strength, leadership or appetite misread as authority. Power, after all, is not measured only by one's ability to insult or threaten. It is measured by the quality of order one can sustain around oneself. A superpower that unsettles its allies for domestic applause is not displaying pure dominance. It may be displaying strategic impatience, at war with its own long-term interests. That is where the public narrative and actual reality diverge most sharply. Publicly, the event can be packaged as another combative exchange in an age of endless conflict. But beneath that surface, something more consequential has taken place. A neighboring ally demonstrated that the old grammar of intimidation may no longer function automatically. A crowd responded not to rage, but to disciplined rebuttal. A supposed show of force created an opening for an alternative model of leadership, one rooted in control, fluency, and institutional seriousness. That is not a trivial reversal. It suggests that even in an era saturated with spectacle, there remains a constituency for authority that looks like adulthood. And adulthood is now in short supply across much of the democratic world. That scarcity increases its value. In unstable periods, publics may flirt with chaos, reward transgression, even romanticize disruption. But when they sense that the disruption is no longer merely transgressive, but dangerous to trade, dangerous to alliances, dangerous to price stability, dangerous to the credibility of the state, they begin to search for another center, not a bland center, not a passive center, a forceful center, a center able to say no, a center able to absorb pressure and remain standing. That is what moments like this can reveal, not only what voters are angry at, but what they are exhausted by. The strategic implication is that we may be entering a phase in which competence itself becomes populist in effect, not because it abandons complexity, but because it speaks to a public desire for restoration of control. Carney, in this framing, is not merely a technocratic figure answering a political attack. He becomes the representative of an alternative promise that a state can still be run by people who understand systems, that sovereignty can still be articulated without descending into frenzy, and that democratic strength can still wear a suit, speak in complete sentences, and refuse to be baited into the swamp. If that image takes hold, the impact of this moment will extend well beyond one confrontation. For Canada, the implications are profound. A country long accustomed to defining itself carefully in relation to the United States may now feel new permission to define itself more assertively against forms of American political pressure that violate the etiquette of alliance. That does not mean anti-Americanism, it means strategic differentiation. It means recalibrating the psychology of the relationship. Mature partnerships require respect that survives disagreement. When that respect is publicly challenged, the answer cannot always be quiet management behind closed doors. Sometimes it must be visible. Sometimes a nation must hear itself defended in unmistakable terms. Sometimes deterrence begins in language. That is what this looked like, deterrence in language. Not military deterrence, not economic retaliation, but the first and perhaps most important form of resistance in democratic politics, refusing the definition imposed by another, refusing the frame, refusing the hierarchy. In that sense, the roar of the crowd was not just applause, it was ratification. It was the public certifying that the answer had met the moment, that the line had held, that the country had not been rhetorically reduced in its own hearing. Those moments matter because they shape what leaders believe their societies will support in the harder days that may follow. And harder days may indeed follow. If the broader political climate continues to reward aggressive nationalism, then episodes like this will not remain isolated. Trade tensions can intensify, border politics can harden, defense arrangements can become sites of leverage rather than trust. Information battles can become more personalized, more inflammatory, more destabilizing. What appeared at first as a single clash of personalities may prove to be an early marker of a larger transition in North American political relations. The warning embedded in this moment is simple. Once mutual confidence erodes, even highly integrated systems become arenas of suspicion. That is why the deeper audience for this confrontation is not only the crowd in the room, nor even the two national electorates. It is the entire network of officials, investors, strategists, military planners, and allied observers trying to determine what kind of political weather now surrounds the Western order. They are studying not only who said what, but what kind of response now works, what kind of language restores equilibrium, what kind of leadership can convert instability into coherence. In that sense, the event has become diagnostic. It has shown where the pressure points are. It has also shown where the counterpressure can come from. So let us be absolutely clear about what this means. A political attack intended to diminish Canada instead elevated the principle that Canada cannot be casually diminished. A performance designed to project unilateral force instead highlighted the enduring power of disciplined democratic reply. A moment that might have been swallowed as spectacle instead became a referendum on respect alliance behavior and the limits of intimidation in a changed geopolitical era. That is why this backfired, not because the news cycle said so, because the structure of the encounter said so, because the emotional outcome said so, because the strategic implications say so. And the story does not end when the applause fades. Moments like this enter memory. They harden assumptions. They rewire expectations. They change how future threats are interpreted and how future answers are delivered. What was revealed here is not simply that one attack failed, it is that a new threshold may have been crossed in the politics of allied resistance, where countries long expected to absorb American turbulence in silence may now answer it in the language of sharpened sovereignty and public resolve. If that is what we have just witnessed, then this was more than a backfire. It was a signal that the old habits of deference are weakening, that the architecture of Western partnership is being renegotiated in real time, and that the consequences of this shift, economic, diplomatic, psychological, historical, are only beginning to arrive.